Hi, Molly.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm great.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Molly Crockett. You also go by MJ, right? One is, you're kind of, you sign your academic papers MJ Crockett, is that right? And that's your byline when you write in?
Occasionally, yes.
Oh, you haven't decided yet on what your brand is?
Sort of.
Yeah, okay. But you go by Molly.
Yes.
Your friends call you Molly. Okay, so you are in the psychology department at Yale, although at the moment you're in England, I guess at Cambridge,
correct.
where you did your graduate work. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we're going to talk about something that a lot of people are talking about, a growing number, which is probably a good thing, which is how social media are ruining everything, to put perhaps an overly fine point on it. But in particular, something you've written about is how social media serves as a conduit for outrage in ways that are not always optimal from a social point of view, you could say. You had a piece recently in the Globe and Mail, and I gathered that was somewhat based on a kind of essay you had done for an academic journal. Is that right?
That's right. I published a paper in September in Nature Human Behavior called Moral Outrage in the Digital Age. And this was a sort of theoretical and data-based treatment of how we might start to think about the ways that social media, digital technologies might be changing the way we experience outrage and express it.
Okay. And why don't we, before we get into that, why don't we step back and look a little at the way, the nature of your work and the way you approach these issues. I mean, first of all, you're kind of in the neuroscience side of things. I mean, do you do brain scan studies and stuff?
Yes, I do. So my PhD training was at the University of Cambridge with Trevor Robbins, who's best known for his work on the neurobiology of decision-making and impulsivity. And in my work, I adopt a strong theoretical and empirical tradition from reinforcement learning, which a lot of the work was done here at Cambridge many years ago. And so I try to approach questions in the social space, questions around morality and social conflict, through the lens of reinforcement learning and its neural basis. So we use behavioral experiments, brain imaging, sometimes pharmacological treatments, all to understand the mechanics of the way we learn and make decisions.
Okay. And I gather that one kind of emerging theme in neuroscience along these lines is that the line between kind of cognition and affect is not as clear as maybe was once thought. In other words, what we think of as decision-making often involves feelings, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that kind of plays into this, the subject of our conversation, because I think a lot of people are under the impression that on social media they're behaving in some sense rationally, right? I mean, sometimes people get so whipped up that on reflection they understand that it's a feeling-driven thing when they're deciding to share or retweet or whatever. But I mean, is it your sense that people overestimate their rationality in general, but also the way they behave on social media?
I'm not sure that people are necessarily thinking about it in terms of rational or irrational. I think probably people are just mostly engaging with the technology and not considering the ways in which they're engaging with it. I saw a study recently about people's perceptions of how others view them when they post on social media, and the data suggested that people aren't really considering the long-term consequences of, for example, sharing photos of themselves or whatnot. And I just started thinking about this mainly from introspecting on my own behavior in the aftermath of the election, as so many of us have done, and I noticed myself getting more and more sucked into the outrage feedback loop. And because I've studied how this works in the brain and the mind, I'm also a longtime meditation practitioner. So I'm sort of combining those two perspectives made me realize that maybe the technology was taking intentionality out of the process in ways that we might not want.
Well, mentioning meditation has given me an opportunity for self-promotion, which I always welcome. You're in this piece in the Globe and Mail. I noticed on rereading it, actually, that you write, harnessing digital outrage for social good will require a mindful awareness of how social media manipulates our emotions. And I've started a newsletter called the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which is somewhat about this. It's based on the idea that resistance to Trump would be more effective if it were indeed more kind of mindfully governed, to some extent, just in the everyday sense of the word mindful. Just kind of pay attention and be reflective. But I wasn't sure whether you yourself actually had a. So you actually meditate, and you have for some time.
Yes.
Can I ask?
And I had seen your newsletter actually in about the week before I wrote the piece, so I was thinking about it in some part thanks to you.
Yeah, and then we actually put a link to your piece in the newsletter. Good. So so you so your meditation practice is long-standing?
Yeah, I actually started when I was a PhD student here at Cambridge in a tradition called samatha, which is a sort of Theravada and Thai tradition of meditation practice focusing on the breath and mindfulness and the sort of quite traditional approach to it.
And you've stuck with it.
I have.
Okay, so let's talk about and your piece in the Globe and Mail kind of starts off this way. The question that maybe a lot of people don't ask is like, why are we prone to moral outrage and moral judgment in the first place? Like in terms of why this is part of human nature.
Yeah, I think that considering the evolutionary perspective can be very helpful in understanding why this is such a strong emotion. And I think there are at least two really good explanations for why this could have evolved. One is more at the group level and one is more at the individual level. And there's a lot of really excellent work from colleagues of mine and others in the field arguing that on the one hand, moral outrage is a really powerful enforcer of social norms and it encourages bad actors to improve their behavior, so it's good for the group. And moral outrage is also good for individuals because it signals to other people that you're the kind of person who wouldn't break that rule and you're the kind of person who could be trusted and relied on to be a good cooperator. And so you've got this two-pronged set of benefits for the group and for the individual, which I think both could have helped the behavior and the emotion to evolve. The interesting question now is, how does the world we live in today change those incentives? And I think that social media dials up the volume on the personal benefits because social media lets you broadcast how moral you are to your whole network when you express outrage. But because in some part being on social networks segregates us to an extent into groups of like-minded individuals. In the case of political outrage, it's not clear whether expressing outrage is good for the group anymore.
Yeah. I think it's worth reflecting a little on just the fact that we have this tendency. I mean, moral outrage is different from other related things. It's like if a rabid squirrel attacks a member of your family, your aggressive, instincts are activated and you kill it, but you don't say, how dare it, right? And so, so this moral outrage is different from kind of garden variety, self-protective, aggressive behavior. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, is this, in neuroscience, is this starting to show up? I'm not clear on how kind of fine-grained the resolution is at this stage in the evolution of kind of the brain scan stuff. Are they getting a pretty clear idea of what kinds of things in the brain reflect specifically moral evaluation?
I would say that the picture at this point is still pretty rough. So in the domain of moral outrage and punishment behavior, there have been some studies comparing what we refer to as second-party punishment and third-party punishment. So second-party punishment is punishing somebody who's harmed you, And third party punishment is punishing somebody who's harmed another person or the group or something that's not directly affecting you. And for the most part, there seems to be a lot of overlap in the neural mechanisms that drive second and third party punishment, despite the fact that you could probably argue that third party punishment is closer to like a moralistic kind of punishment because there's no self interest involved. And both of those kinds of studies suggest the involvement of a reinforcement circuitry involving striatum, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the same circuitry that's involved in all kinds of value-based decisions. So in my view, the evidence points towards moral decisions engaging the same kind of brain mechanisms that are used in ordinary value-based decisions, like what to have for breakfast or what shoes to buy or something like that. I know there has to be some distinctive feature because there are, I think, real differences between moral decisions and other kinds of decisions, but there are not any smoking guns that I have seen yet. If there were a set of brain areas that seem to be disproportionately involved in moral decisions over other kinds, it would be prefrontal cortex, which is the more recently evolved part of the brain and is involved in sort of higher order cognitive processes, awareness, attention, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not surprised by a certain amount of overlap between individual and kind of between first party and third party moral outrage, because in both cases, you are, again, it's going to be, even the first party outrage is different from the rabid squirrel case.
That's true.
You are summoning the part of your brain that argues that this is right and this is wrong is going to get activated in both cases, whether it's first party or third party. Mm-hmm. I mean, an experiment I'd like to see actually is kind of one that distinguishes kind of between my feeling aggrieved personally, being outraged on my behalf, and my doing something more like fending off a rabid squirrel. So, so maybe in your laboratory, you should just actually unleash rabid squirrels on people.
Rabid squirrels, yeah. That's.
Well,
would you like to be the first participant in that study?
I was thinking I would conduct the study and not actually be a subject, but I'll give it some thought.
Okay.
So, but that it does seem to me that's kind of the thing you'd like to distinguish. But so you just alluded to cost, that when you punish someone who is deemed a transgressor, whether you think they've transgressed against you or against the group or against someone in the group, it comes at a cost to you. I mean, certainly, if you imagine real physical social interaction,
yes.
At least, like go back and imagine a hunter-gatherer environment, you're picking a fight with somebody. Being on bad terms with someone carries a cost. They're less likely to help you in the future. They may retaliate by saying bad things about you, lower your social status. We think that social status was, the esteem you're held in was correlated with getting genes into the next generation. So you would expect natural selection to take account of the cost and so make us somewhat careful in picking moral fights. But one point you make in the piece is that the cost side of the equation changes on social media, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there are many ways in which the technology makes it just so much easier to express outrage. Just physically, it's easier. You have this machine in your pocket all the time where with the click of a button, you can respond to somebody or retweet or react to what they say. You're also not face to face with the person. So that means retaliation costs are reduced, empathic costs are reduced. It's hard to be harsh to somebody's face, and so if you can't see their face, then it's easier to express outrage towards them. And the fact that we're in many cases connected with people who agree with us means that we're less likely to get pushback from people who disagree because they may not even see the message. Right.
And I guess one cost of polarization is that once you start just thinking of the people that you're punishing as just being in this other tribe, you basically don't care at all. It's no longer a cost in a sense if they're the ones you're antagonizing.
Exactly.
So, so you and there's a couple of studies you cite. Actually, I'm looking at these. Okay, well, this gets into the whole business of algorithms and sharing, and and of course we should say that, to some extent, even before social media, people are sharing machines. I mean, there's stuff gets shared in any social environment, right? We decide whether to pass on news and so on. But in your view, the current context is pretty seriously altering the dynamics, right?
Well, the function of information sharing in our evolutionary history was information that is valuable is going to spread. And I think that humans are pretty good at figuring out what kinds of information are valuable. But that was before we had an ecosystem where the way we get our information is controlled by corporations who make more money, not as a function of how valuable the information is for us, but how long we pay attention to it. And so that incentivizes all kinds of disinformation, misinformation. So this is how we get fake news. This is how we get really partisan content that doesn't even necessarily have any useful information in it. It just ticks our outrage buttons. And there's now quite a lot of research showing that the best predictors of virality are the extent to which this information can trigger strong emotions. And that is a useful proxy for what was useful in our evolutionary past. And that's why we want to share it. But there is a worry that there's now a kind of decoupling between the usefulness of information and how extreme it is, because we now are able to create all kinds of really unrealistic and outrageous content that doesn't necessarily track with reality.
Okay. And you mentioned a couple of studies in this piece, University of Pennsylvania study and an NYU study that shed light on what kinds of things spread on social media. You want to talk about those?
Sure. So the UPenn study looked at New York Times most emailed headlines, and they coded those headlines according to a number of factors, including what kinds of emotions they triggered. And then they looked to see at what elements of the headline best predicted the number of shares, which they were able to get from the New York Times. And that study showed that that emotions were really strong predictors of sharing, in particular high arousal emotions like anger and surprise. The second study by Billy Brady and colleagues at NYU came out very recently, and they developed a method to specifically detect moral emotions in tweets. And they found that every moral emotional word in a tweet increases its retweet likelihood by 20%. But what's more, the sharing of moral emotional tweets was constrained within ideological networks. So they were also able to code whether individual Twitter users were more liberal or more conservative. Content diffuses from liberals to other liberals and from conservatives to other conservatives, but not so much between those groups. So there's a very partisan element to sharing of moral emotional information.
So if I tweet something that is emotionally, kind of affectively negative, but not morally judgmental, like what a shame that Stephen Hawking died or something, that's more likely to spread across ideological bounds than if I say so-and-so died and it's just as well he was a jerk or something. I mean, it's because well, first of all, that's the idea, right?
Well, the idea is that specifically moral emotions spread more quickly and further than emotions that don't have moral content. So in your example, the Stephen Hawking example, that would not spread as far in any direction as a moral emotional expression.
Okay, so the first, the Penn study establishes that sharing is about emotion, The NYU study establishes that moral emotions spread more effectively than plain old emotions.
Yeah.
But then what is the thing about, is it that, maybe I got it wrong when in listening to you, but what is the thing about whether something spreads within your tribe or across tribal lines that
So, yeah.
Go ahead.
If you express outrage about something that Trump has done, then it would be retweeted by other liberals, but not any conservatives you're connected to.
Okay, so morally judgmental things. And do you know if they distinguish between morally negative and morally positive? The tendency would be to focus on condemnation because that's mostly what we see. Do you happen to recall whether they looked at both?
So in the original paper, they didn't. They just categorized words according to whether they were sort of had moral and emotional content. Although now that I'm thinking back, it's actually possible they did differentiate in the very long supplementary materials of the paper. So I would have to go back and check. But the lead author of that paper, Billy Brady, is actually coming to work in my lab in a couple of months. And he is working on developing more fine-tuned measures that will specifically look at outrage, and that's what we're planning to study.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the fact that moral judgments in particular spread more within your tribe further reduces the cost of spreading them, because it isn't just that, hey, you don't really care what people in the other tribe think anyway. You're really less likely to get feedback from them. You're less likely to get the negative feedback. You care less about it anyway because they're not in your tribe. So all of this encourages, it's important to remind people how unusual this is. I mean, the overwhelming majority of human evolution took place in a hunter-gatherer context. In a small hunter-gatherer village, you can whisper behind people's back, but stuff is pretty much out there. I mean, for the most part, your views are known. It's and in any event, the point of moral condemnation would almost be for it to be public. So this really is a new kind of dynamic, this kind of cost-free condemnation and outrage. I think it is different. Although I will point out the caveat that I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's a total filter bubble in the sense that conservatives are well aware that liberals are outraged about things they're doing and vice versa. I don't think that there's any secret what one side thinks about the other. But of course, the nature of polarization is such that because we're in such an entrenched us versus them situation, outrage on the part of liberals is actually probably in some context seen as a good thing by conservatives and vice versa. Like if you're doing stuff to make liberals mad, then that's a sign you're achieving the goals that you set out to achieve. And I think you've written about outrage expression being potentially counterproductive in this way. And that's something I've been thinking a lot about too, because if we get into a situation where people are just reacting to things that make them outraged and expressing that, but then that has the counterproductive effect, the unintended consequence of actually strengthening exactly the forces that you are hoping to disrupt with your outrage, then that's probably something we should at least be aware of and maybe try to do something to counteract. Right. Yeah, I just had a conversation that we posted with Catherine Mangue Ward, who she's the editor of this libertarian magazine, Reason. But she had written this piece in the New York Times about this feedback cycle, this feedback between what she describes as kind of liberal smugness and conservative trolls. I mean, but leaving aside whether there's actually that much of an asymmetry between what they're doing, the point is they arouse each other. They sustain and intensify the expression of emotion on both sides, to the extent that there is the interaction between the tribes. But the thing about the new environment is you can, and that's bad in its own right when that's happening, but you can arrange things so that you're more or less oblivious to that you don't get much feedback from the other tribe. It depends on who you follow on Twitter. You can construct, as this is, term filter bubble is well known, and you can construct it so that you're relatively oblivious to the the blowback. This is certainly a new thing in. I mean, certainly it's not the state of nature, I guess is the way I would
exactly.
I would put it. So this all seems reasonably grim. You mentioned earlier the signaling function of moral outrage. So part moral outrage can serve to actually punish a transgressor, someone who is like stealing people's food or not participating in the group hunting. I mean, to take this back to a more natural environment. But it can also be to advertise the fact that you're a good person who people should trust and should do business with. And virtue signaling has become kind of a popular term, but its origins are actually academic, right? I mean, this is a technical function of moralistic expression.
That's right. So work by Pat Barkley from about 10 years ago, and more recently, Jill Jordan and Dave Rand in my department at Yale have looked at the way we perceive people who punish and express outrage. And there's a positive perception there. If you express outrage about something, if you punish another person for doing something wrong, particularly if that's third-party punishment, if you're incurring some cost for the good of the group, then that is seen as a very positive thing, and that sort of wins you friends and trust and social capital. And so it provides a solution to how outrage could have evolved, because although it's to some extent individually costly in the moment, the idea is that those costs get recovered by the social capital that you gain from expressing outrage.
Mm-hmm. And do you find the virtue signaling in social media pretty intense and annoying?
Well, it's certainly something that I have become more wary of, both in myself and in other people. And as I've been working on this, I've tried to use social media more intentionally. And so now there's always this voice in my head of what is my intention here? Is this information actually useful to people, or am I trying to just sort of show what team I'm on? Am I sharing this because it just feels satisfying in the moment, but I'm not really thinking about the long-term consequences? And it would be great if we could encourage more people to do that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think actually your meditation practice helps with all this? Not overreacting in various ways, not doing various kinds of counterproductive or kind of gratuitous moral expression online?
I have noticed that periods where I'm more devoted and active with my own practice tend to be periods where I'm less caught up in the social media cycle. That's for sure.
So let's talk about these algorithms, the much discussed algorithms that govern our feeds on Facebook and I guess increasingly Twitter. They have been much increasingly criticized, which I think is a good thing when you think about how much power they have to shape our everyday experience. I mean, if they're determining what shows up in your feed. But, I'm also wondering to what extent the problem is inherent in almost any sharing technology. In other words, if you go back to kind of baseline Twitter, which I wish we still had, it was totally straightforward. It was like you can do two things. You can retweet or you can like, although it was then called favorites instead of likes. But the point is, if you retweeted something, everyone who follows you would see it. If you liked something, no one who followed you would see it unless they chose to go look at your likes. Meanwhile, you could be assured of seeing everything that the people you follow retweet in exactly the order they retweeted it or tweeted it. And you would see nothing more. You would not see the likes. And Twitter, I honestly don't know how far they've departed from this. But they've departed. I mean, for one thing, they at the top of your feed, and you can fiddle with some of the settings maybe and change some of this, but the default thing is at the top of your feed, there's some stuff that's gotten particular traction and in case you missed it. And then they show you stuff that people liked and didn't just retweet. So But my question is, if you go back to baseline Twitter, which seems to me like almost just having the features that any social media involving sharing is going to have, right? There's basically no algorithm beyond the bare bones in baseline Twitter, but we would kind of still have a problem just by virtue of the fact, the studies you cited, saying, hey, we tend to share emotionally, and we especially share on the basis of moral emotions, right?
That's right. I think one of the main problems that these platforms struggle with is that once you get beyond a handful of people that you follow, you have to decide some way how to display the information. And I guess the sort of most neutral way would be to just display a random sample of information. But these companies have set up their business model in a particular way that strongly incentivizes people to stay on the platforms as long as possible, because then they and their advertisers make more money. And so I think what's different about the ecosystem that we find ourselves spending more and more time in is that the determinants of the kinds of information that rise to the top of the feed are those features that make it more likely to be shared, and that's how the environment selects for content that might be in the category of what we would call in sort of biology supernormal stimuli. Mm-hmm. So stimuli that have features of natural stimuli but exaggerated. Mm-hmm. And so that's, and if you look at any kind of fake news headline, it has the features of a real news headline, but it exaggerated the parts that tick our emotional buttons.
Right, and there was a study recently showing that fake news, not surprisingly, fake news spreads more effectively than real news. And of course, part of that is that fake news is not constrained by reality. If you just want to construct the kind of story that appeals to people when they think it's true, it's not hard to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, and what all these algorithms do, increasingly Twitter, to the extent that it's paying attention to things that accumulate a lot of likes quickly, is that, they pick up on things that have emotional valence. It almost has to be emotional valence they have if they're starting to spread and be liked and shared really quickly, right? So any algorithm that departs from bare bones is almost certainly going to magnify the influence of emotion and moral emotion.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Which is bad. So now there's a further thing you mention, and that in your piece, and that I'd read something about, and I guess maybe this was something that is comes from Tristan Harris, or at least he's emphasized it. He's a former Google, I guess you call him former Google design ethicist. In any event, he's become something of a crusader about algorithms. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he mentions that smartphones are like slot machines in our pockets. That's a reference to this variable reinforcement pattern.
Yeah.
Now, is that something they're actually building into the algorithms, or is that just kind of happening? I'm going to be really annoyed if they're if they're that literally treating us like laboratory rats.
Well, the properties of the algorithms are secret, so I can't say for sure. But I do know that there's at least one company that calls itself Dopamine Labs that is very explicit that it's using principles from experimental psychology to make engagement with apps as addictive as possible. And I don't really like to throw the term addiction around a lot, because addiction has a very specific set of features that I'm not sure social media use completely satisfy. But I think it is reasonable to say that there is a variable interval reinforcement like pattern that goes on, and this is well known to promote habit formation, and this is almost certainly going to be a principle that's deployed by designers of technology.
So the form variable reinforcement would take is it the case that Twitter is going to be more habit forming for me if, like, the feedback I get on my tweets is really not consistent? Like, I'll tweet something and it's massively popular, and then I'll go a few times without the reinforcement, and then I'll get a little reinforcement, and then none, and then a big hit. That's going to keep me tweeting more than any kind of constant reinforcement.
That's right.
Okay. You mentioned fake news, and I want to talk about the nature of that. But before we get into that, I just this may not run for a week or so, but as we're taping this, I just saw an example today of the kind of, this is not quite fake news, but it's kind of borderline. So Trump had just fired Rex Tillerson and appointed Mike Pompeo as the new Secretary of State. And, word spread that this came right after Rex Tillerson had said something critical of Russia. And, of course, the whole meme is that Trump is insufficiently hard on Russia for, there are grounds for suspicion, of course. But, Bill Kristol tweeted something like, so I guess you could say that Tillerson lost and Putin won. Well, that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny because Mike Pompeo, the replacement, is like ardently anti-Russia. There's
right.
real problems with that story, but it was massively retweeted, and I'm just kind of want to say there's a kind of there's kind of something that's not technically fake news. It's just implausible opinion, kind of, but that gets reinforced, right? I mean. That's the thing, that through variable reinforcement or whatever, without even, so in other words, Bill Kristol doesn't have to be consciously, you tell me, is the way reinforcement works that Bill Kristol or whoever could get drawn into repeatedly tweeting these ill thought out, like, allegations without thinking, hey, this is going to help, and it's actually ill thought out and implausible, but actually kind of like just being conveniently uncritical?
I think that these kinds of reinforcement processes can absolutely operate at a non-conscious level, at a level that's below our sort of reflective awareness. That's true.
Okay. Now on to fake news. You talk about that in the piece. That's, I don't know. You and again, fake news it's not just things that were manufactured in a laboratory in Russia, right? Fake news can begin kind of innocently as an errant report, as a first on-the-scene report, right?
Yeah. And I think, there are a lot of people who have a lot of things to say about fake news these days. It's a very hot topic. I think the way I'm thinking about fake news is that the distinction between fake and real is obviously important, but I think it's equally important to think about the distinction between content that is really outrage triggering and content that is less so. And I think you'll find that fake news maps more onto the outrage triggering category than does true content. And again, the distinction between real versus fake isn't necessarily helpful because, as you rightly point out, there's a lot of misinformation and harmful information that's not exactly fake, but is not in the domain of cold hard facts and useful for public discourse. So I think that moral emotions like outrage can contribute to the fake news problem, in particular because it can lead opponents of a piece of fake news to actually inadvertently help it spread because they're outraged about it and tweeting about how outraged they are that there's this fake news. This is something that we saw after the Parkland shootings, where the conspiracy theory that the kids were paid crisis actors was trending at one point on YouTube, and it came to light shortly after that most of the sharing of this information was not by people who believed it, but by people who are outraged about it and tweeting about it. And like, this is like a classic kind of own goal situation where you're like, you don't want, the purpose of outrage is being perverted and actually helping do exactly the thing it purports to be against. Right. And I personally don't want to participate in that, and I think it's good if we avoid participating in that.
Right. And I think that this they found that a few really influential progressives with huge followings, including I think Chelsea Clinton, had spread the conspiracy theory inadvertently by being dismissive of it. And I guess maybe the idea is, if you're actually going to bring just killer facts to bear on it, right? Like, this is false as shown here, that's one thing. But that's not what these influential progressive tweeters had done. And they had just been kind of casually dismissive, and so they probably hurt their own cause. So you close your piece by talking about some of the costs of, I guess you could say not engaging mindfully on social media. One of them is just the sheer distraction by fake news, right? It's lost time. But then you mentioned some other things. You say degrades the ability of outrage to distinguish the truly atrocious from the merely disagreeable. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that there's a risk of there being a signal to noise problem, in the sense that if social media dials up the volume on outrage generally and just makes everything louder, then it may be more difficult to distinguish between those offenses that we really want to focus our attention on and those attentions that are maybe less important to be outraged about or to take action on. And one really good example was after the Parkland shootings, and I allude to this in my piece. People were expressing a lot of outrage about what had happened, about the lack of action on the part of lawmakers to do something about gun control, about the NRA's continued influence, and these were all causes that I think deserve attention. But then you also had people expressing outrage about Trump having a note card reminding him to express empathy for the students in his meeting, and that to me just seems like a bit of a distraction, and in some ways counterproductive too. If we would like for the students to have an empathic listener in there with them, then it seems like an odd thing to try and punish Trump for. And I mean, there are plenty of things that are worthy of our attention in that domain, but that seemed to me to be more distracting than useful. And I think that is a perfect example of how the fact that it's so easy to express outrage on social media means that the threshold is going to be lower, but then that can reduce this signal to noise and make it harder to distinguish those offenses that deserve our attention.
Yeah. I think also sometimes fixation on those things just kind of reinforces Trump's narrative, popular among his base, that he is persecuted by the media hates him, which they kind of do. I mean, he's not really making it up. I mean, but the fact is that it's a narrative that kind of reinforces his base, I think, and I mean, and it isn't just outrage per se. I mean, my one of the things I keep remembering is like when people made fun of Melania because of what she wore to a hurricane, basically. I mean, they went to visit a hurricane site and she had high heels on, and right. I was amused. But anyway, last thing you say is, if your news feed is constantly making your blood boil, you may not have energy left for actions that make a difference. I guess that's self-explanatory.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one thing I want to emphasize is that this is really early days in terms of the research, and there are a lot of effects of social media that we don't fully understand yet, and there's a lot of active efforts in my field to try and understand this better. And the question of what some people call outrage fatigue is a really important topic, and it's not totally clear. I think there's evidence sort of in both directions. One, that there could be a sort of burnout effect, and expressing outrage constantly online may just deplete your energy for doing anything more. But on the other hand, I think there's also evidence that there's a sort of foot in the door effect where low-level acts of political engagement can lead to more involved ones, and so it's something that we're trying actively to understand at the moment. But at the very least, just being self-aware of how you're using this technology and whether, just in your own introspection, whether you feel more inclined to go to a march or to vote if you've spent all day on Twitter. Like, this is something that we as individuals can do regardless of what the progress is on the research front. So I would encourage everyone to do that.
Okay. Well, I think we kind of covered the waterfront. As far as your take on this, what other stuff are you working on? Is your work very much focused on these kinds of issues, or?
Well, it's funny. I spent almost 10 years working pretty intensively on outrage and punishment, and then I kind of had drifted into studying other aspects of moral behavior, in particular how people decide whether to benefit themselves at the cost of harm to other people, and we still have a lot of active work in that area. But then, of course, the election happened, and I was also living in the UK at the time of Brexit, and so there were all these changes happening in the world, and I felt like I had some tools to try to understand them. And so this is a sort of relatively new aspect of our research program, trying to bring to bear theories from moral psychology, evolution of cooperation, and reinforcement learning to understanding how these new technologies might be affecting our social lives. And so we're investing a lot in that at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, Brexit's interesting because, the UK does not have the equivalent of the Trump phenomenon right now, but the kind of division that Brexit did reflect is kind of comparable to the kind of division that the Trump thing reflects. And I'm wondering, do things seem kind of like, does the tension seem markedly less intense in Britain now, or is it very comparable and even playing out comparably on social media?
Oh, it's very difficult to know. And I moved back to the U.S. 6 months ago, and so I'm sort of more immersed in the U.S. conversations now. But I definitely saw many common themes in Brexit and in the election of Trump over the past couple of years. And I think there are a lot of really compelling explanations that link both of those processes, as well as other events around the world, to growing inequality and sense of powerlessness amongst a lot of people, growing diversity, which is threatening people's sense of identity, and just general sense of uncertainty that I think is putting a lot of people on edge. So it's an interesting time to be doing psychology and behavioral science.
And an interesting time to be alive, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Where can people find your stuff? I mean, first of all, what's your Twitter handle?
It is at Molly Crockett, MOLLYCROCKETT, and my lab's website is crocketlab.org.
Okay, great. And we will put your Twitter handle on the site, and we'll also include a link to the Globe and Mail piece and maybe some of your other stuff. Well, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, take care.